33. The different importance of the ranks of the sword and the pen in the various dynasties. It 542 should be known that both the sword and the pen are instruments for the ruler to use in his affairs. However, at the beginning of the dynasty, so long as its people are occupied in establishing power, the need for the sword is greater than that for the pen. In that situation, the pen is merely a servant and agent of the ruler's authority, whereas the sword contributes active assistance. The same is the case at the end of the dynasty when its group feeling weakens, as we have mentioned, and its people decrease in number under the influence of senility. As we have stated before, 543 the dynasty then needs the support of the military. The dynasty's need of the military for the purpose of protection and defense is as strong then as it was at the beginning of the dynasty, for the purpose of getting established. In these two situations, the sword, thus, has the advantage over the pen. At that time, the military have the higher rank. They enjoy more benefits and more splendid fiefs. In mid-term of the dynasty, the ruler can to some degree dispense with the sword. His power is firmly established. His only remaining desire is to obtain the fruits of royal authority, such as collecting taxes, holding property, excelling other dynasties, and enforcing the law. The pen is helpful for all that. Therefore, the need for using it increases. The swords stay unused in their scabbards, unless something happens and they are called upon to repair a breach. For purposes other than that, swords are not needed. In this situation, the men of the pen have more authority. They occupy a higher rank. They enjoy more benefits and greater wealth and have a closer and more frequent and intimate contact with the ruler. At such times, the pen is the instrument the ruler uses to obtain the fruits of his royal authority. He uses it to supervise and administer his realm and to display its excellent condition. At such a time, the wazirs and the military can be dispensed with. They are kept away from the intimate circle of the ruler and have to beware of his moods. It is in this sense that Abu Muslim wrote the following reply to Al-Mansur when he ordered him to come to him, and now, we remember the following admonition of the Persians: the most fear-ridden thing there is the wazirs when the mob has calmed down. 544. This is how God proceeds with his servants. 34. The characteristic emblems of royal and government authority. It should be known that the ruler has emblems and arrangements that are the necessary result of pomp and ostentation. They are restricted to him, and by their use he is distinguished from his subjects, his intimates, and all other leaders in his dynasty. We shall mention the best known emblems as well as our knowledge permits. And he knows more than any scholar. 545. The out, Allah. One of the emblems of royal authority is the outfit, Allah, that is, the display of banners and flags and the beating of drums and the blowing of trumpets and horns. In the book on politics ascribed to Aristotle, Aristotle mentioned that its real significance is to frighten the enemy in war. 546. Frightful sounds do have the psychological effect of causing terror. Indeed, as everyone knows from his own experience, this is an emotional 547 element that plays a role on battlefields. The explanation given by Aristotle, if it was he who gave it, is correct in some respects. But the truth is that listening to music and sounds no doubt causes pleasure and emotion in the soul. The spiritual temper of man is thereby affected by a kind of drunkenness, which causes him to make light of difficulties and to be willing to die in the very condition in which he finds himself. This state of affairs exists even in dumb animals. Camels are influenced by the driver's call, and horses are influenced by whistling and shouting, as everyone knows. The effect is greater when the sounds are harmonious ones, as in the instance of music 548. It is known what happens to people who listen to music. The non-Arabs, therefore, take musical instruments, drums or trumpets, onto the battlefield with them. Singers with instruments surround the cavalcade of the ruler and sing. Thus, they move the souls of brave men emotionally and cause them to be willing to die. In the wars of the Arabs, in northwestern Africa, we have seen persons in front of the cavalcade sing poetical songs and make music. The minds of heroes were stirred by the contents of the songs. They hurried to the battleground, and everybody went forth eagerly to meet his rival. The same was the case with the Zenata, one of the nations of the Maghrib. A poet went in advance of the battle lines and sang. His music was such as to move firmly anchored mountains and to cause men who would otherwise not think of it, to seek death. That music is called Tajagite 549 by the Zenata. The origin of it all is the cheerfulness created in the soul, through music. It leads to bravery, just as drunkenness leads to bravery, as the result of the cheerfulness which it produces. And God knows better. The great number of flags, their manifold colors, and their length, are intended to cause fright, nothing more. Fright produces greater aggressiveness in the soul. Psychological conditions and reactions are strange. God is the creator, they. Knowing 1. 550. The various rulers and dynasties differ in their use of such emblems. Some of them use a great many, others few, according to the extent and importance of the given dynasty. Flags have been the insignia of war since the creation of the world. 551. The nations have always displayed them on battlefields and during raids. This was also the case in the time of the Prophet and that of the caliphs who succeeded him. The Muslims, however, refrained from beating drums and blowing trumpets at the beginning of Islam. They wanted to avoid the coarseness of royal authority and do without royal customs. They also despised pomp, which has nothing whatever to do with the truth. The caliphate then came to be royal authority, and the Muslims learned to esteem the splendor and luxury of this world. Persian and Byzantine clients, subjects of the preceding, pre-Islamic, dynasties, mixed with them and showed them their ways of ostentation and luxury. Among the things the Muslims came to like was the outfit, Allah. Therefore, they used it and permitted their officials to use it, to increase the prestige of royal authority and its representatives. Abbasid or Ubaidid, Fatimid, caliphs would often grant permission to display their flags to officials such as the master of a border region or the commander of an army. Such officials then, setting out on a mission or going from the house of the caliph or from their own houses to their offices, were accompanied by a cavalcade of people carrying flags and the attributes of the outfit, Allah. The only distinction between the cavalcade of an official and that of the caliph was the number of flags, or the use of particular colors for the caliph's flag. Thus, black was used for the flags of the Abbasids. Their flags were black as a sign of mourning for the martyrs of their family, the Hashemites, and as a sign of reproach directed against the Umayyads who had killed them. Therefore, the Abbasids were called the Black Ones, al-Musawwida. When the Hashemites divided into factions and the Alids, descendants of Abu Talib, went against the Abbasids on every possible occasion, they wanted to differ from them in the color of their flag, and so they used white flags. Therefore, they were called the White Ones, al-Mubayyida. White was used by the Alids throughout the reign of the Ubaidid, Fatimids. It was also used by the Alids who seceded at that time in the east, such as the Zaydi, missionaries in Tabaristan and in Sada, in the Yemen, and those other Alids, who made propaganda for the extremist, Shia, such as the Qarmishans. When Al-Mamun gave up wearing black and using the black insignia of his dynasty, he turned to green and used green flags. The details of the outfit could be increased ad infinitum. When Al-Aziz Nizar set out to conquer Syria, 552, the outfit, Allah, of the Ubaidid, Fatimids, was composed of 500 banners and 500 trumpets. The Sinhaja and the other Berber rulers in the Maghrib did not affect special colors, but they embroidered their flags in gold and made them of pure colored silk. They always permitted their officials to use these flags. But when the Almohads and, later on, the Zenata, Marianides, made their appearance, they restricted the use of the outfit, Allah, of drums and banners to the ruler, and forbade all other officials to use it. It formed a special cavalcade in the procession which followed immediately behind the ruler. It was called the rear guard, Saga. They used a larger or smaller number of instruments, according to the different customs of the various dynasties. Some of them restricted themselves to 7, as a lucky number. This was the case in the dynasties of the Almohads and the Banu al-Ahmar, Nasrids, in Spain. Others went up to 10 or 20, as was the case with the Zenata. In the days of Sultan Abul Hassan, as we learned personally, 553 it went up to 100 drums and 100 banners of colored silk interwoven with gold, both large and small. They permit their governors, officials, and generals to use one small flag of white linen and a small drum in wartime. They do not permit them any more. The contemporary Turkish dynasty in the east uses, in the first place, one large flag, surmounted by a big tuft of hair. It is called the Chalish or Chitr 554, it 555 is used, with the army in general. Then, there is another flag, carried, over the ruler and called the Isaba or Shatfa 556, it is the ruler's insignia. There are many other flags which they call Sanjuk, 557, which means flag in Turkish. They use an excessively large number of drums, which they call K6s. They permit any emir or general to use whatever insignia he desires, with the exception of the Isaba, 558, which is reserved to the ruler. The contemporary Galicians, a European Christian nation in Spain, use only a few flags, which fly high in the air. In addition, they make a kind of music with string and wind instruments on the battlefields. This is all the information we have about them and the non-Arab rulers who live beyond them. In the creation of the heavens and the earth and in the difference of your tongues and colors, there are, indeed, signs for those who know. 559. Throne, dais, couch, chair, they all mean pieces of wood or ottomans set up for the ruler, so that he may have a higher seat than the other people at court and so that he will not be on the same level with them. This has always been a royal custom, even before Islam and in the non-Arab dynasties. The pre-Islamic rulers sat upon thrones of gold. Solomon, the son of David, had a throne of ivory overlaid with gold. However, dynasties use a throne only after they have become flourishing and luxurious, as is the case with all pomp, as we have stated. 560 dynasties that are in the beginning stage and still keep the Bedouin attitude do not desire it. The first to use a throne in Islam was Muawiyah. He asked the people for permission to use one, saying that he had become corpulent 560, so they permitted him to use one, and he did. His example was followed by all the later Muslim rulers. The use of an ornate throne came to indicate a tendency toward pomp. One day Amr Al-Aziz was in his castle in Egypt, sitting on the ground with the Arabs. The Muqaddimah 561 came to the castle. He had men carry out a throne of gold, so that he could sit upon it like a king. He sat on it in front of the Arabs. They were not jealous of him, because they felt that they had to give him the protection upon which they had agreed, and because they rejected royal pomp. Later on, the Abbasids, the Ubaidid, Fatimids, and all the other Muslim rulers in both the east and the west, had thrones, daises, and couches that eclipsed, in splendor, those of the Persian and Roman emperors. God causes the change of night and day. 562. The Mint 563. The Mint is concerned with the stamping of the dinars and dirhams used in commercial transactions. This is done with a die of iron, upon which pictures or words are engraved in reverse. The stamp is pressed upon the dinar or the dirham, and the designs, legends, of those engravings appear on the coin clearly and correctly. Before this is done, the standard of purity of the particular coin, the result of repeated refinings, is taken into consideration, and the individual dinars and dirhams are given the proper, fixed weight that has been agreed upon. Then, the number of coins, and not their weight only, can be made use of in transactions. If the individual pieces have not been given the weight fixed upon, then the weight of the coins must be taken into consideration. The word sika, mint, refers to the stamp, that is, the piece of iron used for the purpose of stamping the coins. The word was then used to designate the result of the application of the stamp, that is, the engravings that appear upon dinars and dirhams. The word was further used to designate control of the process of engraving, and supervision of the whole operation. Of everything dealing with coinage and all the conditions that govern it. Such control and supervision is exercised by the office of the mint. The word has thus come to designate that office, and is customarily so used in governmental usage. It is an office that is necessary to the royal authority, for it enables people to distinguish between good and bad coins in their transactions. That the coins are not bad is guaranteed by the engravings known to have been stamped upon them by the ruler. The non-Arabs used coins, and engraved special pictures on them, for example, a picture of the ruler at the time of issue, a fortress, 564 some animal or product, or something else. This remained the practice of the non-Arabs down to the end of their power. When Islam appeared, the practice was discontinued, because of the simplicity of Islam and the Bedouin attitude of the Arabs. In their transactions, they used gold and silver according to weight. They also had Persian dinars and dirhams. They used them, too, according to weight and employed them as their medium of exchange. The government paid no attention to the matter. As a result, the frauds practiced with dinars and dirhams eventually became very serious. According to the reports of Saidb al-Musayyib and Abu Zinad, 565 ABD al-Malik ordered al-Hajjaj to coin dirhams, and bad coins began to be distinguished from good ones. This took place in 74-699/94, or, according to al-Madaini, 566 and 75-694/95. In the year 76-695/96, Abd al-Malik ordered that dirhams be coined in all the other regions. The legend upon them was, God is one, God is the Samad. 567. Later on, in the days of Yazid b. Abd al-Malik, Ibn Hubayra became governor of the Iraq and improved the mint. Then Khalid al-Kasrite, and after him Yusuf b. Umar, made great efforts to improve it. It is also said that the first to coin dinars and dirhams, in Islam, was Musab b. Aziz Ubayr 568. He did it in the year 7689/90 in the Iraq, upon the order of his brother Abdallah, who was then in charge in the Hijaz. The legend on his coins was, on the one side, blessing, and on the other, there was, the name of God. A year later, al-Hajjaj changed the legend, and the new legend was, in the name of God al-Hajjaj. 569. The weight of the dirhams was fixed at what it had been in the days of Umar. At the beginning of Islam, the weight of the dirham had been 6 dinaks. The weight of the mithqal was 1 dirham and 3/7 of a dirham, so that 10 dirhams made 7 mithqals. The reason for this was that the weight of the dirham had varied in the days of the Persians. A dirham corresponding to the weight of a mithqal might weigh 20, or 12, or 10 carats. When it was necessary to determine the weight of the dirham, for the charity tax, the average of the three values was taken, that is 14 carats. Thus, the mithqal, of 20 carats, was 1 dirham, and 3/7 of a dirham, of 14 carats. It is said that the Bakli, dirham, had 8 dinaks, the Tabari, dirham, 4, the Maghribi, dirham, 3, and the Yaman, dirham, 1. 570 Umar gave orders to investigate and determine which dirham was most commonly used in transactions. It turned out to be the Bakli and the Tabari, dirhams. Together they weighed 12 dinaks. Thus, the weight of the dirham was fixed at 6 dinaks. When 3/7 of that weight was added, it was a mithqal, and when 3/10 of a mithqal were taken away, it was a dirham. When Abd al-Malik saw fit to use the mint to protect against fraud, the two coins, the gold dinar and the silver dirham, that were current in Muslim transactions, he determined their values as what they had been in the time of Umar. He used the iron stamp, but engraved words on it, rather than pictures, because eloquent words were obviously more congenial to the Arabs. Moreover, the religious law forbids pictures. After Abd al-Malik, the coinage remained the same for the whole Muslim period. Both the dinar and the dirham were round. The inscription on them was written in concentric circles. On one side, the legend included the names of God with the formulas, "There is no God but God and praised be God," and the prayer for the Prophet and his family. On the other side, it included the date and the name of the Caliph. Coins were of this type during the period of the Abbasids, the Ubaidid, Fatimids, and the Spanish Umayyads. The Sinhaja had no mint except at the end of their rule, when Al-Mansur, the master of Bougie, used one. This has been mentioned by Ibn Hamid in his History 571. For the Almohads, Al-Mahdi set the precedent of coining square dirhams and engraving a square on the round dinar. 572 He covered one side of the coins with the formulas, "There is no God but God and praised be God," and the other with a legend of several lines containing his name, which was replaced by his successors with their names. This became the practice of the Almohads. Their coinage has kept that shape down to this time. It has been reported that before Al-Mahdi came forth, he was described as master of the square dirham by the practitioners of magic who predicted the coming of his dynasty. The present-day inhabitants of the East have no coinage of fixed value. For their transactions, they use dinars and dirhams by weight, and their value is determined through standard weights corresponding to so and so many dirhams, or dinars. The mint engraves 573 on them the formula "There is no God but God" and the prayer for the Prophet, as well as the ruler's name, as is also the practice of the Maghribis. This is the decision of the mighty, the knowing one. 574. Note: 575 We shall conclude our discussion of the mint by explaining the meaning of the legal dirham and the legal dinar and their value. The dirham and the dinar differ in value and weight in different regions, cities, and provinces. The religious law has had occasion to refer to these coins, and has mentioned them in connection with many laws concerning the charity tax, marriage, fees, fixed legal fines, and other things. Therefore, the religious law must have its own dirham and dinar, with a specific value given to them by the religious law itself, and agreeing with the intention of the religious law. These coins are then the ones to which the laws refer. They are different from the non-legal coins. It should be known that since the beginning of Islam and the time of the men around Muhammad and the men of the second generation, the legal dirham is by general consensus the 1/10 of which are equal to 7 mithqal of gold, and an ounce of gold is 40 dirhams. Thus, the legal dirham is 7/10 of a dinar. A gold mithqal weighs 72 average-sized grains of wheat. Consequently, the dirham, which is 7/10 of a mithqal, has a weight of 50 2/5 grains. All these values are accepted by general consensus. The pre-Islamic dirham was of several kinds. The best was the Tabari, a dirham of 8 dinaks, and the Bakli, a dirham of 4 dinags. 576 For the legal dirham, they took the mean, that is, 6 dinaks. The charity tax on 100 Bakli dirhams or 100 Tabari dirhams was fixed at 5 such mean dirhams. People do not agree, however, that the value of legal dirhams was established only by Abd al-Malik and by general consensus later on. As we have reported and as was mentioned by al-Katabi 577 in the Kitab Ma'alim as-Sunan and by al-Mawardi in the Kitab al-Aim as-Sultaniyya 578, thorough scholars of recent times do not think so. Because it would imply that legal dirhams and dinars were not known in the time of the man around Muhammad and subsequently, even though legal tariffs such as the charity tax, marriage, fees, fixed legal fines, and other such things are based on them, as we have just mentioned. The truth is that the value of legal dirhams and dinars was known at the earliest times of Islam, for the implementation of laws involving tariffs based on legal dirhams and dinars, but their value was not individually specified outside. It was an internal custom of the Muslims, which had become accepted under the influence of the religious law, and which used a fixed value and weight for dirhams and dinars. The Muslim dynasty thereafter became great and flourishing. Conditions called for individual specification of the value and the weight of dirhams and dinars, in accordance with the religious law, in order to obviate the constant obligation to determine their value. This situation developed in the days of Abd al-Malik. He specified the individual value of the dinar and the dirham, outside, in real money, as it had been in theory 579 on the coins. He engraved his name and date after the two confessions of faith: I confess there is no God but God, and I confess that Muhammad is the messenger of God. Abd al-Malik withdrew the pre-Islamic coins altogether. They were eventually purified, melted down, and re-engraved with a legend, so that, in their original form, they became non-existent. This is the inescapable truth. Later on, officials of the mint in the various dynasties deliberately disregarded the legal value of dinar and dirham. Their value became different in the different regions. The people reverted to a theoretical knowledge of the legal dinar and dirham, as had been the case at the beginning of Islam. The inhabitants of every region calculated the legal tariffs in their own coinage, according to the relationship that they knew existed between the actual value of dirhams and dinars in their coinage, and the legal value. The weight, in gold, of the dinar is 72 average-sized grains of wheat. This is reported by thorough scholars and is the general consensus from which only Ibn Hazm deviates. Ibn Hazm thought that the weight of the dinar is 84 grains. This was reported as Ibn Hazm's opinion by Judge Abd al-Hukt 580. Thorough scholars have refuted Ibn Hazm's opinion. They considered it an unfounded assumption or an error, and rightly so. God causes the truth to come true in His words. 581. It is also known that the legal ounce is not the one which is commonly used among the people, because the commonly used ounce differs according to the various regions, while the legal ounce is a theoretical unit which admits of no differences. God created everything. Then, He determined it. 582. The seal. 583. Use of the seal is one of the government functions in a royal office. The sealing of letters and diplomas was known to rulers before and after Islam. It has been established in the two Sahihs that when the Prophet wanted to write to the Byzantine emperor, he was told that the non-Arabs accepted only sealed letters. Thus, he took a silver seal, ring, and had the following legend engraved upon it: Muhammad, the messenger of God. Al-Bukhari said that he had the three words 584 written in 3 lines and that he used that ring for sealing. Muhammad said, no one else should use a similar legend. He continued, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman used that ring for sealing. Then, it fell from Uthman's hand into the well of arts. There was much 585 water in it, and its bottom could never be reached later on. Uthman was worried about the happening and considered it a bad omen. He had 586. Another ring made like it. The way of engraving the seal, as well as its use for sealing, have different aspects. This is because the word seal is used for the instrument that is placed on the finger. From it, the verbal form, Muqaddimah he puts the seal on is derived. Or, the word, is used to designate end or completion. In this meaning, one says Qadamtu al-Amra I reached the end of the matter, or Qadamtu al-Qur'ana I finished reading the Quran, also Qadam and Nabi in the last of the prophets. 587 and Khatimat al-Am are the end of the matter. The word is also used for the stopper with which bottles or barrels are closed. In this sense, one uses the form Khatam. Thus it is said in the Quran, Wa Khatamuhu miskin its stopper is musk. 588 Those who interpret the word here to mean end or completion are wrong. Their interpretation is based on the assumption that the last impression they have of their drink is the smell of musk. However, this is not the intended meaning. It is derived here from khatam in the meaning of stopper. A stopper of clay or pitch is put upon the wine in the barrel. This preserves the wine and gives it a good smell and taste. In an exaggerated manner, the wine of paradise was thus described, in the Quran, as being closed with a stopper of musk, which is better smelling and tasting than clay or pitch, which are customarily used, for the purpose, in this world. If the word seal is correctly used in all these meanings, it is, also, correctly used for designating the result that comes from the application of sealing in all these meanings. This is as follows: when words or shapes are engraved upon a seal, and it is then put into a paste of clay or an ink solution and placed upon a paper surface, those words, or shapes, will be reproduced on that surface. The same is the case if the seal is impressed on some soft material such as wax. The engraved legend remains impressed on it. If the legend consists of words, they are to be read from the left, if the engraving started correctly from the right, and from the right if the engraving started from the left. Because the process of sealing reverses the direction of the writing on the paper surface and appears on it as the opposite of what it had been on the engraving, with right and left transposed. It is, also, possible to use the seal by putting it in ink and clay and placing it upon the paper surface. The words then appear engraved on it. This process of sealing expresses the idea of end or completion, in the sense that a writing thus sealed is correct and valid. A particular letter somehow becomes effective through the use of such a signature, alama. 589 Without it, it would be invalid and imperfect. The sealing may, also, be effected through something written by hand at the end or the beginning of a letter, some well-chosen words of praise and glory, the formulas praised be God and glory to God, or the name of the ruler or emir, or of the writer of the letter, whoever he may have been. Or through terms descriptive of the writer. Such formulas, written by hand, indicate the correctness and validity of the letter. They are commonly known under the name of signature, alama, but are also called seal because they are compared to the impression of the seal ring. The seal the judge sends to litigants is connected with this usage. That seal is his signature and hand, validating his decisions. The seal of the ruler or caliph, that is, his signature, is also connected with the usage referred to. When Ar-Rashid wanted to make Jafar wazir in the place of his brother Al-Fadl, he said to their father Yahya b. Khalid, "Father, I want to change my seal from my right hand to my left hand." He thus used the word seal for the wazirate, since it was one of the duties of the wazir in Abbasid times to put his signature on letters and diplomas. The correctness of the use of seal in this meaning is confirmed by At-Tabari's report on Muawiyah's negotiations with Al-Hasan. When Muawiyah wanted to persuade Al-Hasan to enter into an armistice, he sent him a blank sheet of paper, which he sealed at the bottom, and he wrote to him, "Write down, on this sheet of paper, which I have sealed at the bottom, whatever conditions you want to make. They are granted." 590 Sealing here means a handwritten or other signature at the end of a sheet of paper. It is also possible to impress a seal upon some soft substance, so that the letters of the legend appear on that substance, and to place the substance, with the seal impression, on the knots of the strings with which letters are tied, 590a, and upon places for deposits, such as storehouses, strong boxes, etc. This use of the root khtm is derived from the meaning of stopper mentioned before. In both cases, we are dealing with the result of the application of the seal, and, therefore, the word seal can be used in this sense. The first to introduce the sealing of letters, that is, the use of the signature, was Muawiyah. He ordered Amr b. Aziz Ubayr to be given 100,000 dirhams by Ziyad b. Abthi in Al-Kufa. The letter, containing the order, was opened, and the figure was changed from 100,000 to 200,000. When Ziyad presented his account, and the excess payment was noticed, Muawiyah disavowed it. He held Amr responsible for the money and kept him in prison until Amr's brother Abdallah paid the sum for him. On that occasion, Muawiyah introduced the ministry, Dejuan, of the seal. This was mentioned by At-Tabari 591, who finished his statement by saying that he tied the letters with strings. Formerly, they had not been tied, it means, he closed them. The ministry, Dejuan, of the seal is composed of the secretaries who see to it that the letters of the ruler are expedited and sealed, either by means of a signature, or by tying them. The word Dejuan is used for the place where these secretaries had their office, as we mentioned in connection with the ministry, Dejuan, of taxation. 592 letters are tied either by piercing the paper and tacking the letter together with the string, as is the custom of the secretaries of the Maghrib, or by gluing the top of the sheet to the part of the letter over which the top is folded, as is the custom of the people in the East. Over the place where the letter is pierced and tacked, or where it is glued, a signature is placed. It guarantees that the letter has not been opened and that its contents have not been read. The people of the Maghrib place a piece of wax where the letter is pierced and tacked, and seal it with a seal upon which some signature is engraved for use in sealing, and the engraving is impressed upon the wax. In the old dynasties of the East, the place where the letter was glued was also sealed with an engraved seal that was put into a red paste of clay prepared for that purpose. The engraving of the seal was impressed upon the clay. Under the Abbasid dynasty, this clay was called sealing clay. It was imported from Saraf 593. It seems that this clay was restricted to the purpose of sealing. The use of the seal, which is the hand-written signature or engraving used for closing and tying letters, was peculiar to the Ministry of Correspondence, Dewan ar-Raza'il. In the Abbasid dynasty, it belonged to the wazir. Later on, custom differed. It went to those who were in charge of official correspondence and the office of the secretaries in the various dynasties. In the dynasties of the Maghrib, people came to consider the seal ring as one of the royal marks and emblems. They made artistic seal rings of gold inlaid with gems of hyacinth, ruby, turquoise, and emerald. The ruler, according to their custom, wore the seal ring as an insignia, exactly as the Prophet's cloak and stick. 594 were used in the Abbasid dynasty and an umbrella in the Ubaidid, Fatimid, dynasty. God governs all affairs in His wisdom. 595. The Tiraz. It is part of royal and governmental pomp and dynastic custom to have the names of rulers or their peculiar marks embroidered on the silk, brocade, or pure silk garments that are prepared for their wearing. The writing is brought out by weaving a gold thread or some other colored thread of a color different from that of the fabric itself into it. Its execution depends upon the skill of the weavers in designing and weaving it. Royal garments are embroidered with such a tiraz, in order to increase the prestige of the ruler or the person of lower rank who wears such a garment. or in order to increase the prestige of those whom the ruler distinguishes by bestowing upon them his own garment when he wants to honor them or appoint them to one of the offices of the dynasty. The pre-Islamic non-Arab rulers used to make a tiraz of pictures and figures of kings, or other figures and pictures specifically designed for it. The Muslim rulers later on changed that and had their own names embroidered together with other words of good omen or prayer. In the Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties, the tiraz was one of the most splendid things and honors. The houses within the palaces in which such garments were woven were called tiraz houses. The person who supervised them was called tiraz master. He was in charge of the craftsmen, the implements, and the weavers in the tiraz houses, the payment of their wages, the care of their implements, and the control of their work. The office of tiraz master was entrusted by the Abbasids to their intimates and their most trusted clients. The same was the case with the Umayyads in Spain and their successors, the Reyes de Taifas, as well as with the Ubaydid, Fatimids, in Egypt and the eastern non-Arab rulers contemporary with them. When luxury and cultural diversity receded with the receding power of the great dynasties, and when the number of small dynasties grew, the office and its administration completely ceased to exist in most dynasties. When, at the beginning of the 6th–12th century, the Almohads succeeded the Umayyads, they did not have the tiraz at the beginning of their dynasty, because they had been taught by their Imam Muhammad b. Tumurt al-Mahdi the ways of religion and simplicity. They were too austere to wear garments of silk and gold. The office of the tiraz, therefore, had no place in their dynasty. Their descendants in the later years of the dynasty, however, re-established it in part, but it was not nearly as splendid as before. At the present time, we have personally seen quite a lot of tiraz manufacture in the flourishing and proud Marinid dynasty in the Maghrib. The Marianides had learned it from the Contemporary dynasty of the Ibn al-Ahmar, Nasrids, in Spain. They, in turn, followed the tiraz customs of the Reyes de Taifas and achieved in this respect something that speaks for itself. In the contemporary Turkish dynasty of Egypt and Syria, the tiraz is very much cultivated in accordance with the importance of the realm of that dynasty, and the civilization of its country. However, the tiraz is not produced within the houses and palaces of the dynasty, and it is not an office of the dynasty. The tiraz, which is required by the dynasty, is woven by craftsmen familiar with the craft, from silk and pure gold. They call it zarkash, a Persian word. The name of the ruler or emir is embroidered on it. It is made by craftsmen for the dynasty, together with other fine products, such as are fitting for the dynasty, and are produced for it. God determines night and day. He is the best heir. 596. Large tents and tent walls. It should be known that one of the emblems of royal authority and luxury is small and large tents and canopies of linen, wool, and cotton, with linen and cotton ropes. They are used for display on journeys. They are of different kinds, large or small, according to the wealth and affluence of the dynasty. At the beginning of the dynasty, the same type of housing used by the people of the dynasty before they have achieved royal authority, continues to be used. At the time of the first Umayyad caliphs, the Arabs continued to use the dwellings they had, tents of leather and wool. Only a very few of the Arabs had at that date ceased to live in the Bedouin manner. When they went on raids or went to war, they traveled with all their camels, their nomad households, hilal, and their dependent women and children, as is still the case with the Arabs at this time. Their armies, therefore, consisted of many nomad households, and the distance between the encampments was great. The groups were widely separated, and each group was too far away to see the other, as is still the case with the Arabs. That was why Abd al-Malik used to need drivers, say a rear guard, to keep the people together and make them follow him, in the event they did not move after he had started to move. It is reported that Abd al-Malik employed al-Hajjaj for that purpose upon Rahbi Zinbas 597 recommendation. The story of how al-Hajjaj, as soon as he was appointed to that office, had the large and ordinary tents of Rah burned when he discovered they were not on the move the day Abd al-Malik had begun to move, is well known. The fact that al-Hajjaj was entrusted with the office shows what rank he held among the Arabs. 598 The task of getting them to move was entrusted only to a person in no danger of being attacked by stupid Arab groups, one who possessed a group feeling sufficient to forestall such attacks. Therefore, Abd al-Malik singled out al-Hajjaj for the rank, because he was confident that al-Hajjaj possessed enough group feeling and energy for it. The Arab dynasty then adopted diverse ways of sedentary culture and ostentation. People settled in towns and cities. They were transformed from tent dwellers into palace dwellers. They exchanged the camel for the horse and the donkey as riding animals. Now, they used linen fabrics for their dwellings on their journeys, fashioning them into houses, tents, of various shapes and sizes, round, 599 oblong, or square. In this connection, they displayed the greatest possible pomp and art. Emirs and army leaders surrounded their large tents and canopies with a tent wall of linen. In the language of the Berbers of the Maghrib, the tent wall is called a frag 600. It is restricted to the ruler there. No one else has it. In the East, it is used by every emir, whether he is the ruler or not. The habits of luxurious living then caused women and children to stay behind in their palaces and mansions. People, therefore, traveled light. The spaces between the encampments of the army became less far apart. Army and ruler encamped in one and the same camp, which was completely within the field of vision, of a single observer. It was a pretty sight because of the various colors. This remained the way dynasties displayed their luxury. It has also been this way in the Almohad and Zenata dynasties whose shadow extends over us. At the beginning of their power, when they traveled they used the ordinary sleeping tents they had used before they achieved royal authority. However, eventually, the dynasty adopted the ways of luxury, and people began to dwell in palaces. Then, they turned to using tents both large and small to a greater extent than they had intended, when they started using them. It is a great luxury. However, armies become more vulnerable to night attacks when they are assembled in one place, where a sudden attack may involve them all. Furthermore, they do not have their families and children with them, and it is for their families and children they would be willing to die. Therefore, other protective measures are needed in this connection, as we shall mention. 601. God is strong and mighty. 602. The prayer enclosure, Magsarah, and the prayer during the Friday sermon. These two things are caliphal prerogatives and royal emblems in Islam. They are not known in non-Muslim dynasties. The enclosure for the ruler to pray in is a latticed screen around the prayer niche, mihrab, and the space immediately adjacent. The first to use one was Muawiyah b. Abi Sufyan, after a Kharijite had stabbed him. The story is well known. It is also said that the first to use one was Marwan b. al-Hakam, after a Yemenite had stabbed him. 603 Afterwards, all the caliphs used it. It became a custom distinguishing the ruler from the rest of the people during prayer. It arises only when dynasties are luxurious and flourishing, as is the case with all pomp. It remained this way in all Muslim dynasties when the Abbasid dynasty dissolved and the number of different dynasties in the east grew. It also remained so in Spain when the Umayyad dynasty was destroyed and the Rayazdi Taifas became numerous. As for the Maghrib, the Aqlabids used it in Al-Qayrawan. It was used later on by the Ubaydid, Fatimid, caliphs and by their Sinhaja governors of the Maghrib, by the Banu Badis in Al-Qayrawan and by the Banu Hamid in Al-Qala. 604 When the Almohads then took possession of all the Maghrib and Spain, they abolished the institution of the prayer enclosure, in accordance with the desert attitude that characterized them. But then the dynasty flourished and acquired its share of luxury. When the third Almohad ruler, Yaqub al-Mansur, appeared, he used a prayer enclosure. Afterwards, its use remained a custom of the rulers of the Maghrib and of Spain. The same was the case with all other dynasties. This is how God proceeds with his servants. As to the prayer from the pulpit, minbar, during the Friday sermon, it should be said that the caliphs at first directed the prayers themselves. Therefore, they used to say a prayer, for themselves, after the obligatory prayer for the prophet and the blessings for the men around him had been spoken. The first to use a pulpit was Amr b. Alais when he built his mosque in Egypt. Umar b. al-Khattab wrote to him, "And now, I have heard that you use a pulpit and thus raise yourself above the necks of the Muslims. Is it not sufficient for you that you are standing while the Muslims are at your heels? Therefore, I urge you to smash it to bits." 605. When pomp came into being and the caliphs came to be prevented from, personally delivering, the sermon and leading the prayer, they appointed delegates for both tasks. The preacher mentioned the caliph from the pulpit. He mentioned his name in praise and prayed for him, because God had appointed him in the interest of the world, and because a prayer at such an hour was thought likely to be heard. Also, the ancients had said, "He who has a good prayer shall say it for the ruler." The first to pray for the caliph during the sermon was Ibn Abbas. As Ali's governor in al-Basra, he prayed for Ali during his sermon. He said, "O God, help Ali, who represents the truth." 606. This practice was continued afterwards. 607. Only the caliph was mentioned. But when the time came that the caliphs were secluded and under the control of others, the men who were in control of the various dynasties often shared the prayer with the caliph, and their names were mentioned after his. When these dynasties disappeared, the custom also disappeared. Only the ruler was privileged to be mentioned in the prayer from the pulpit, and no one else. No one was permitted to share that privilege with the ruler or to aspire to do so. The founders of dynasties often neglected this institution when the dynasty still had a low standard of living and preserved the negligent and coarse Bedouin attitude. They were satisfied with a summary, anonymous reference to the one entrusted with the affairs of the Muslims. Such a sermon was called an Abbasid sermon. This meant that the summary prayer could refer only to the Abbasid caliph, following the ancient tradition. They did not think of going beyond that, of clearly indicating the ruler and pronouncing his name. The story goes that the Emir Abu Zakaria Yahya b. Abi Hafs took Tlemcen away from the founder of the Abdulwahid dynasty, Yagam Razan b. Zayyin 608. He then decided upon returning him to power under certain conditions, which he stipulated. Among them was the condition that his, Abu Zakaria's, name should be mentioned from the pulpits of Yagam Razan's province. On that occasion, Yagam Razan said, the pulpits, are those pieces of wood 609 of theirs from which they mention whomever they like. Also, the ambassador of Al-Mustansir, the third 610 Hafsid caliph in Tunis, was at the court of the founder of the Marinid dynasty, Yaqub b. Abd al-Haqt. One day, he was late in attending the Friday service. Yaqub was informed that the ambassador did not attend the service because the sermon did not include mention of his ruler. Thereupon, Yaqub gave permission to pray for him. This was one of the reasons why the Marianides took up the Hafsid propaganda. Such was the attitude of dynasties at the beginning, when they still had a low standard of living and preserved the Bedouin outlook. But when their political eyes were opened and they looked toward all the aspects of royal authority and perfected the details 611 of sedentary culture and the ideas of ostentation and pomp, they adopted all the external attributes of royal authority, and exhausted all the possibilities in this respect. They disliked the idea that anyone else might share in them, and they were afraid that they might lose them and that their dynasty would be deprived of the effect of them. The world is a garden, 612, and God watches over everything. 613. 35. Wars and the methods of waging war practiced by the various nations. Wars and different kinds of fighting have always occurred in the world since God created it. The origin of war is the desire of certain human beings to take revenge on others. Each party is supported by the people sharing in its group feeling. When they have sufficiently excited each other for the purpose and the two parties confront each other, one seeking revenge and the other trying to defend itself, there is war. It is something natural among human beings. No nation and no race, generation, is free from it. The reason for such revenge is as a rule either jealousy and envy, or hostility, or zeal in behalf of God and his religion, or zeal in behalf of royal authority and the effort to found a kingdom. The first kind of war usually occurs between neighboring tribes and competing families. The second kind of war caused by hostility, is usually found among savage nations living in the desert, such as the Arabs, the Turks, the Turkomans, the Kurds, and similar peoples. They earn their sustenance with their lances and their livelihood by depriving other people of their possessions. They declare war against those who defend their property against them. They have no further desire for rank and royal authority. Their minds and eyes are set only upon depriving other people of their possessions. 6:14. The third kind of war is the one the religious law calls the holy war. The fourth kind of war, finally, is dynastic war against seceders and those who refuse obedience. These are the four kinds of war. 6:14a. The first two are unjust and lawless, the other two are holy and just wars. Since the beginning of men's existence, war has been waged in the world in two ways. One is by advance in closed formation. The other is the technique of attack and withdrawal. The advance in closed formation has been the technique of all the non-Arabs throughout their entire existence. The technique of attack and withdrawal has been that of the Arabs and of the Berbers of the Maghrib. Fighting in closed formation is more steady and fierce than fighting with the technique of attack and withdrawal. That is because in fighting in closed formation, the lines are orderly and evenly arranged, like arrows or like rows of worshippers at prayer. People advance in closed lines against the enemy. This makes for greater steadiness in assault and for better use of the proper tactics. It frightens the enemy more. A closed formation is like a long wall or a well-built castle which no one could hope to move. In the divine revelation, it is said, God loves those who fight in his behalf in a line, as if they were a strongly constructed building. 615. That means, they steady each other. A tradition says, one believer is to another believer like a building of which every part supports the rest. 616. This makes it obvious what great wisdom there is in requiring that the lines be kept steady and in forbidding anyone to fall back during an attack. Battle lines are intended to preserve order, as we have stated. Those who turn their backs to the enemy bring disorder into the line formation. They are guilty of the crime of causing a rout. They somehow cause the Muslims to be routed and enable the enemy to gain power over them. This is a great sin, because the resulting damage is general and affects Islam, in that it makes a breach in the protecting fence. Therefore, it is considered one of the great sins. 617. All this evidence shows that fighting in close formation is more important than any other kind, in the opinion of the lawgiver, Muhammad. Fighting with the technique of attack and withdrawal is not as fierce or as secure against the possibility of rout, as is fighting in closed formation, unless there is set up a steady line formation to the rear, to which the fighting men may fall back in attack and withdrawal throughout the fighting. Such a line formation would take the place of the closed formation, as we shall mention later on. 618. The ancient dynasties had many soldiers and a vast realm. They subdivided their armies into smaller units. 619. The reason for this was that their soldiers grew exceedingly numerous and were assembled from the most remote regions. This made it unavoidable that some of the soldiers would not know others, when they mingled on the field of battle and engaged the enemy in shooting and close fighting. It was feared lest, on such occasions, they would fall to fighting each other because of the existing confusion and their ignorance of each other. Therefore, they divided the armies into smaller units and put men who knew each other together. They arranged the units in an arrangement resembling the natural one of the four directions of the compass. The chief of all the armies, either the ruler himself or a general, was in the center. 620. This arrangement was called the battle order, Tabi'ah. It is mentioned in the history of the Persians, that of the Byzantines, and that of the Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties at the beginning of Islam. In front of the ruler stood one army with its own battle lines, its own general and its own flag. 621. It was called the advance guard. Then, to the right of the 622 place where the ruler was, stood another army. It was called the right flank. There was another army to the left, called the left flank. Then, there was another army behind the army, called the rear guard. The ruler and his entourage stood at the middle of these four armies. The place where he was called the center. When this ingenious arrangement was completed, covering an area within the field of vision of a single observer, or extending over a wider area but with at most 1 or 2 days' journey between each of the two armies, and utilizing the possibilities suggested by the greater or smaller number of soldiers, then, when the battle order was thus set up, the advance in closed formation could begin. This may be exemplified by the history of the Muslim conquests and the history of the Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties. There also is the well-known story mentioned above from the history of Abd al-Malik, of how his armies fell back while he was on the move because the elements of the battle order were so widely separated, and how someone was needed to drive them from behind, and al-Hajjaj b. Yusuf was appointed for that purpose. 623. Much the same sort of arrangement was also to be found among the Spanish Umayyads. It is not known among us now, because we live in a time when dynasties possess small armies which cannot mistake each other on the field of battle. 624. Most of the soldiers of both parties together could nowadays be assembled in a hamlet or a town. Every one of them knows his comrade and calls him by his name and surname in the thick of battle. Therefore, this particular battle order can be dispensed with. One of the techniques of the people who use the technique of attack and withdrawal is to set up, behind their armies, a line formation, barricade, of solid objects and dumb animals to serve as a refuge for the cavalry during attack and withdrawal. It is intended to steady the fighters, so that they will fight more persistently and have a better chance of winning. Those who fight in closed formation do the same, in order to increase their steadfastness and power. The Persians who fought in closed formation used to employ elephants in their wars. They made them carry wooden towers like castles, loaded with combatants, weapons, and flags. They disposed them in successive lines behind them in the thick of battle, as if they were fortresses. This fortified them psychologically and gave them added confidence. In this connection, one may compare what happened at Al-Qadisiyah. On the third day, the Persians pressed the Muslims hard with the elephants. 625. Eventually, some outstanding Arabs counterattacked, infiltrated among the elephants, and struck them on the trunk with their swords. The elephants fled and turned back to their stables in Al-Mada'in. This paralyzed the Persian camp, and they fled on the fourth day. The Rum, Byzantines, the Gothic rulers in Spain, and most other non-Arab peoples used to employ thrones for the purpose of steadying the battle lines. A throne would be set up for the ruler in the thick of battle and surrounded by those of the ruler's servants, entourage, and soldiers who were thought to be willing to die for him. Flags were run up at the corners of the throne. A further wall of sharpshooters and foot soldiers was put around it. The throne thus assumed considerable dimensions. It became, for the fighters, a place to fall back upon and a refuge in attack and withdrawal. This was what the Persians did in the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. Rustam sat upon a throne that had been set up for him there. Finally, the Persian lines became disordered, and the Arabs penetrated to Rustam's throne. He abandoned it and went to the Euphrates, where he was killed. The Arabs and most other Bedouin nations that move about and employ the technique of attack and withdrawal, dispose their camels and the pack animals carrying their litters in lines to steady the fighting men. Such lines become for them a place to fall back upon. They call it al. Follows this technique can be observed to be more steady in battle and to be better protected against being surprised and routed. This is a well-attested fact, but it has been altogether neglected by the contemporary dynasties. Instead, they dispose the pack animals carrying their baggage and large tents behind them, as a rear guard. These animals cannot take the place of elephants and camels. Therefore, the armies are exposed to the danger of being routed, and they are always ready to flee in combat. At the beginning of Islam, all battles were fought in closed formation, although the Arabs knew only the technique of attack and withdrawal. Two things at the beginning of Islam caused them to fight in closed formation. First, their enemies fought in closed formation, and they were thus forced to fight them in the same way. Second, they were willing to die in the holy war, because they wished to prove their endurance and were very firm in their belief. Now, the closed formation is the fighting technique most suitable for one willing to die. The first to abandon the line in war and to use the battle order by regiments was Marwan b. al-Hakam 627 in fighting the Kharajite ad-Dahak and, after him, al-Kabari. At-Tabari said in connection with the killing of al-Kabari, the Kharajites appointed as their leader Shayban b. Abdul Aziz al-Yashkuri, who had the surname of Abu Did al-Fa. Marwan, thereafter, fought them in regiments and abandoned the line from that day on. When the line was discontinued, the practice of fighting in closed formation was forgotten. Then, when luxury penetrated the various dynasties, the use of the rally line behind the fighters was forgotten. This was because when they were Bedouins and lived in tents, they had many camels, and the women and children lived in camp with them. Then they achieved royal luxury and became used to living in palaces and in a sedentary environment, and they abandoned the ways of the desert and waste regions. At that time, they forgot the period of camels and litters, and it was difficult for them to use them. When they traveled, they left their women behind. Royal authority and luxury caused them to use tents both large and small. They restricted themselves to pack animals carrying baggage and tents. They used these things to form their protective line in war. It was by no means sufficient. These things, unlike one's own family and property, do not inspire any willingness to die. 628 people, therefore, have little endurance. The turmoil of the battle frightens them, and their lines crumble. We have mentioned the strength that a line formation behind the army gives to the fighters who use the technique of attack and withdrawal. Because of this fact, the Maghribi rulers have come to employ groups of European Christians in their army, and they are the only ones to have done that, for their compatriots know only the technique of attack and withdrawal. The position of the ruler is strengthened by establishing a line formation in support of the fighting men ahead of it. The men in such a line formation must be people who are used to hold firm in closed formation. If not, they will run away like the men who use the technique of attack and withdrawal, and, when they run away, the ruler and the army will be routed. Therefore, the rulers of the Maghrib had to use soldiers from a nation used to hold firm in closed formation. That nation was the European Christians. The line formation around their army is formed by European Christians. The Maghribi rulers do that despite the fact that it means utilizing the aid of unbelievers. They do not think much of it, because the necessity of using such men exists, as we have shown. They fear that their own line formation might run away, and they know that the European Christians know only how to hold firm, because it is their custom to fight in closed formation. They are, therefore, more suitable for the purpose than others. However, the Maghribi rulers employ such European Christians only in wars against Arab and Berber nations, in order to force them into submission. They do not use them for the holy war, because they are afraid that they might take sides against the Muslims. Such is the situation in the Maghrib at this time. We have shown the reason for it. God knows everything. 629. We hear that the fighting technique of the contemporary Turkish nations is the shooting of arrows. Their battle order consists of a line formation. They divide their army into 3 lines, one placed behind the other. They dismount from their horses, empty their quivers on the ground in front of them, and then shoot from a sitting position. Each line protects the one ahead of it against being overrun by the enemy, until victory is assured for one party. This is a very good and remarkable battle order. In war, the ancients followed the method of digging trenches around their camps when they were about to attack. They did that, because they were afraid of treacherous night attacks and assaults by night upon the camp, since darkness and wildness multiply fear. Under such conditions, the soldiers might seek refuge in flight and would find in the darkness a psychological protection against the shame of fleeing. If all the soldiers were to have the same idea, the camp would be disorganized, and there would be a rout. Therefore, they were accustomed to dig trenches around the camp, when they encamped. They set up their tents and made trenches all around them on every side, lest the enemy be able to get through them in a night attack, in which case they would abandon each other. The dynasties used to have the strength and power to do such things involving large concentrations of manpower, wherever they settled, because civilization was prosperous and royal authority impressive. But when civilization was ruined and, the strong dynasties, were succeeded by weak dynasties with few soldiers and no workers, the thing was altogether forgotten, as if it had never been. God is the best of those who have power. One should think of the admonitions and encouragement that Ali gave his men on the day of Siffin. One will find in them a good deal of military knowledge. No one had better insight into military matters than all. He said in one of his speeches, "Straighten out your lines like a strongly constructed building 630. Place the armed men in front, and those who are not armed in the rear. Bite on your molars. This makes it harder for sword blows to harm the head. Keep something wrapped around the tips of the spears. This preserves the sharpness of points. Keep the eyes down. This keeps the soul more concentrated and gives greater peace to the heart. Kill all noises. This drives vacillation away more effectively and is more becoming to dignity. Do not hold your flags inclined and do not remove them. Place them in the hands only of those among you who are brave. Call upon truth and endurance for aid, for after endurance there is victory." Al-Ashtar 631 on that day, to encourage the aged, said, "Bite on your molars and meet the people, enemy, head on. Be violent like men who, long frustrated from their revenge, are now out to revenge their fathers and their brothers, who are full of wrath against the enemy, and who have prepared themselves for death, so that they shall not be prevented from taking revenge and not be disgraced in this world." Abu Bakr as-Sarraf, the poet of the Lamtuna, Almoravids, and the Spaniards, has referred to many such things in a poem in which he praises Tashfin b. Ali b. Yusuf and describes his steadfastness during a battle in which he participated. 632 He refers to his military affairs. In words of admonition and warning that make a great deal of knowledge concerning warfare available to the reader. He says in the poem, "O you veiled 633 people! Who among you is the high-minded, inspiring ruler? Who is the one whom the enemy surprised in the dark, and everyone dispersed, but he was not discouraged? And the nights came, but fighting with spears kept them from him. The loyalty of his troops confounded them, and they turned back. And the gleam of helmets made the night appear like the morn sparkling over the heads of the soldiers. Where 634 have you taken refuge, now, O Banu Sinhaja? You, who were the refuge in fear. You have turned away from Tashfin. If he wished, he could punish you. A pupil that no eyelid of yours has ever protected, and a heart that the ribs have betrayed. You are nothing but lions of the thicket." 635. Each one of you, watching for every possible unpleasantness that might befall. O Tashfin, make the night an excuse for your soldiers, an irresistible destiny not to be repelled. The following verses of the poem are about warfare. I shall give you the political education that the Persian kings before you were desirous to obtain. Not that I am experienced in it, but it is a memento that spurs on the believers, and is useful. Put on the double coat of mail that a Tuba exhorted skillful craftsmen to make, 636. And the fine Indian dagger, because it is more effective against thick armor and pierces it better. Use a number of fast horses, and horsemen, a strong fortress that cannot be repelled. Dig a trench for yourself when you encamp, regardless of whether you are in victorious pursuit or being pursued. Do not cross a river. Encamp on its bank. It separates your soldiers from the enemy. Go into battle in the afternoon, having behind you a mountain pass 637 that is unapproachable. When the soldiers are in straits on a narrow battlefield, the points of their spears will give them elbow room. Attack the enemy right away, do not hesitate a moment, for to show signs of hesitation is disastrous. Take for your patrols men of energy, in whom truthfulness is an unmistakable characteristic. Do not listen to the liar who comes to you with alarming news. A person under the influence of a lie, acts senselessly 638 whatever he may do. The statement, attack the enemy right away, do not hesitate, etc., is contrary to the general practice of warfare. Umar said to Abu Ubaid b. Masud al-Thaqafi, when he entrusted him with the war against Furs and the Iraq, 639, listen to the men around Muhammad and let them participate in the command. Do not answer hastily, answer only when everything is clear to you. It is war, and only the calm man, who knows when there is an opportunity and when he has to restrain himself, is suited for warfare. According to another report, he said to him, the only thing that prevents me from putting Salat in command is his rashness in war. Rashness in war, unless everything is clear, is disastrous. By God, if it were not for that, I should have made him commander, but only a calm man is suited for warfare. This is what Umar said. It is proof that in war it is better to go slow than to be hasty, until the situation in a particular battle is clear. This is the contrary of what As-Sarif said, unless he means attacking after everything is clear. This is a possible explanation. And God knows better. There is no certainty of victory in war, even when the equipment and the numerical strength that cause victory, under normal circumstances, exist. Victory and superiority in war come from luck and chance. This is explained by the fact that the causes of superiority are, as a rule, a combination of several factors. There are external factors, such as the number of soldiers, the perfection and good quality of weapons, the number of brave men, skillful arrangement of the line formation, the proper tactics, and similar things. Then, there are hidden factors. These hidden factors may be the result of human ruse and trickery, such as spreading alarming news and rumors to cause defections in the ranks of the enemy, occupying high points, so that one is able to attack from above, which surprises those below and causes them to abandon each other, hiding in thickets or depressions and concealing oneself from the enemy in rocky terrain, so that the armies of one's own side suddenly appear when the enemy is in a precarious situation and he must then flee to safety, instead of defending himself, and similar things. These hidden factors may also be celestial matters, which man has no power to produce for himself. They affect people psychologically, and thus generate fear in them. They cause confusion in the centers of armies, and there are routes. Routes very often are the result of hidden causes, because both parties make much use of the opportunities offered by them in their desire for victory. One of them must by necessity be successful in their use. Wherefore, Muhammad said, war is trickery. 640. An Arab proverb says, many a trick is worth more than a tribe. 640a. It is thus clear that superiority in war is, as a rule, the result of hidden causes, not of external ones. The occurrence of opportunities as the result of hidden causes is what is meant by the word luck, as has been established in the proper place. Considering the fact that superiority may be the result of celestial factors, as we have explained, one understands Muhammad's statement, "I was helped through the terror that befell the enemy, for the length of 1 month's journey." 641, the same fact explains Muhammad's victory with small numbers over the polytheists during his lifetime, and the victories of the Muslims during the Muslim conquests after Muhammad's death. God took care of his prophet. He threw terror into the hearts of the unbelievers. That terror, eventually, seized control over their hearts, and they fled. This, then, was a miracle wrought by God's messenger. Terror in the hearts of their enemies was why there were so many routs during the Muslim conquests, but it was a factor concealed from the eyes. At-Tirtushi 642 mentions that one of the reasons for victory in war is that one side may have a larger number of brave and famous knights than the other. For instance, one side may have 10 or 20 famous heroes, and the other only 8 or 16. The side that has more, even if only one more, will be victorious. He states this very emphatically. He is referring to the external causes we have mentioned before, but he is not right. What is the fact proven to make for superiority is the situation with regard to group feeling. If one side has a single group feeling comprising all, while the other side is made up of numerous different groups, and if both sides are approximately the same in numbers, then the side that has a single, comprehensive, group feeling is stronger than, and superior to, the side that is made up of several different groups. These different groups are likely to abandon each other, as is the case with separate individuals who have no group feeling at all, each of the groups being in the same position as an individual. Thus, the side composed of several different groups cannot stand up to the side whose group feeling is one. This should be understood. It should be realized that this is a better explanation than the one attempted by At-Tirtushi. At-Tirtushi's explanation was suggested by the fact that the importance of group feeling was no longer known in his generation and in the place where he lived. 643, people in this situation think of defense, military protection, and the pressing of claims in terms of individuals and masses of individuals. They do not consider group feeling or common descent in this connection. We explained this at the beginning of the book 644. Moreover, such and similar things, if correct, still belong among the external causes of victory, such as the existence of an identical number of soldiers on both sides, the proper tactics, the quantity of weapons, and similar things. How could such things guarantee victory, considering that we have just established that none of them is a match for the hidden causes, such as ruse and trickery, or for the celestial factors, such as divine terror and defection? This should be known, and the conditions of the world should be understood. God determines night and day. 645 The idea of victory in war as depending on hidden and unnatural causes reminds us of the related situation that exists with regard to fame and renown. Fame and renown are rarely to be found in their proper places anywhere in any class of people, whether they be rulers, scholars, pious men, or the virtuous in general. Many people are famous and renowned, yet do not deserve it. Many are reputed villains, yet they are just the opposite. Many have been passed over by fame, and yet they may deserve it and be more entitled to it than others. Sometimes, fame and renown are to be found in their proper places and do conform to the actual merit of the person who enjoys them. The reason for this is that fame and renown are the result of historical information. In the process of transmission, the original intentions are forgotten, and bias and partisanship affect the information, as do unfounded assumptions as well as ignorance of the conformity of the stories to actual conditions. 646 Resulting from the fact that they have become obscured by falsification and artifice, or from the ignorance of the transmitter. The information is also affected by the desire to insinuate oneself into the good graces of great men of the world and other persons of high rank through eulogizing and praising them, embellishing the facts and spreading fame in this manner. 647 The human soul is ardently in love with praise. And people go all out for this world and for the rank or wealth that belong to this world. As a rule, they have no desire for virtue, and they do not care for those who have it. In view of all this, how could we expect there to be any conformity with the truth? Thus, renown results from hidden causes and does not conform to reality. Things that result from hidden causes are what we express by the word luck, as has been established. 36. Taxation and the reason for low and high tax revenues. It 648 should be known that at the beginning of the dynasty, taxation yields a large revenue from small assessments. At the end of the dynasty, taxation yields a small revenue from large assessments. The reason for this is that when the dynasty follows the ways, sunan, of the religion, it imposes only such taxes as are stipulated by the religious law, such as charity taxes, the land tax, and the poll tax. They mean small assessments, because, as everyone knows, the charity tax on property 649 is low. The same applies to the charity tax on grain and cattle, and also to the poll tax, the land tax, and all other taxes required by the religious law. They have fixed limits that cannot be overstepped. When the dynasty follows the ways of group feeling and political superiority, it necessarily has at first a desert attitude, as has been mentioned before. The desert attitude requires kindness, reverence, humility, respect for the property of other people, and disinclination to appropriate it, 650 except in rare instances. Therefore, the individual imposts and assessments, which together constitute the tax revenue, are low. When tax assessments and imposts upon the subjects are low, the latter have the energy and desire to do things. Cultural enterprises grow and increase, because the low taxes bring satisfaction. When cultural enterprises grow, the number of individual imposts and assessments mounts. In consequence, the tax revenue, which is the sum total of the individual assessments, increases. When the dynasty continues in power and their rulers follow each other in succession, they become sophisticated. The Bedouin attitude and simplicity lose their significance, and the Bedouin qualities of moderation and restraint disappear. Royal authority with its tyranny, and sedentary culture that stimulates sophistication, make their appearance. The people of the dynasty then acquire qualities of character related to cleverness. Their customs and needs become more varied because of the prosperity and luxury in which they are immersed. As a result, the individual imposts and assessments upon the subjects, agricultural laborers, farmers, and all the other taxpayers, increase. Every individual impost and assessment is greatly increased, in order to obtain a higher tax revenue. Customs duties are placed upon articles of commerce and levied at the city gates, as we shall mention later on. 651 Then, gradual increases in the amount of the assessments succeed each other regularly, in correspondence with the gradual increase in the luxury customs and many needs of the dynasty and the spending required in connection with them. Eventually, the taxes will weigh heavily upon the subjects and overburden them. Heavy taxes become an obligation and tradition, because the increases took place gradually, and no one knows specifically who increased them or levied them. They lie upon the subjects like an obligation and tradition. The assessments increase beyond the limits of equity. The result is that the interest of the subjects in cultural enterprises disappears, since when they compare expenditures and taxes with their income and gain and see the little profit they make, they lose all hope. Therefore, many of them refrain from all cultural activity. The result is that the total tax revenue goes down, as the number of the individual assessments goes down. Often, when the decrease is noticed, the amounts of individual imposts are increased. This is considered a means of compensating for the decrease. Finally, individual imposts and assessments reach their limit. It would be of no avail to increase them further. The costs of all cultural enterprise are now too high, the taxes are too heavy, and the profits anticipated fail to materialize. Thus, the total revenue continues to decrease, while the amounts of individual imposts and assessments continue to increase, because it is believed that such an increase will compensate for the drop in revenue in the end. Finally, civilization is destroyed, because the incentive for cultural activity is gone. It is the dynasty that suffers from the situation, because it is the dynasty that profits from cultural activity. If the reader understands this, he will realize that the strongest incentive for cultural activity is to lower as much as possible the amounts of individual imposts levied upon persons capable of undertaking cultural enterprises. In this manner, such persons will be psychologically disposed to undertake them, because they can be confident of making a profit from them. God owns all things. 37. In the later years of dynasties, customs duties are levied. It should be known that at the beginning, dynasties maintain the Bedouin attitude, as we have stated 652. Therefore, they have few needs, since luxury and the habits that go with it do not yet exist. Expenses and expenditures are small. At that time, revenue from taxes pays for much more than the necessary expenditures, and there is a large surplus. The dynasty, then, soon starts to adopt the luxury and luxury customs of sedentary culture, and follows the course that had been taken by previous dynasties. The result is that the expenses of the people of the dynasty grow. Especially do the expenses of the ruler mount excessively, on account of his expenditures for his entourage and the great number of allowances he has to grant. The available revenue from taxes cannot pay for all that. Therefore, the dynasty must increase its revenues, because the militia needs ever larger allowances and the ruler needs ever more money to meet his expenditures. 653. At first, the amounts of individual imposts and assessments are increased, as we have stated. Then, as expenses and needs increase under the influence of the gradual growth of luxury customs and additional allowances for the militia, the dynasty is affected by senility. Its people are too weak to collect the taxes from the provinces and remote areas. Thus, the revenue from taxes decreases, while the habits, requiring money, increase. As they increase, salaries and allowances to the soldiers also increase. Therefore, the ruler must invent new kinds of taxes. He levies them on commerce. He imposes taxes of a certain amount on prices realized in the markets and on the various imported goods at the city gates. 653a. The ruler is, after all, forced to this because people have become spoiled by generous allowances, and because of the growing numbers of soldiers and militiamen. In the later years of the dynasty, taxation may become excessive. Business falls off, because all hopes of profit are destroyed, permitting the dissolution of civilization and reflecting upon the status of the dynasty. This situation becomes more and more aggravated, until the dynasty disintegrates. Much of this sort happened in the eastern cities during the later days of the Abbasid and Ubaidid, Fatimid dynasties. Taxes were levied even upon pilgrims making the pilgrimage. Salah ad-Din ibn Ayyub abolished all such institutions and replaced them with good works. The same also happened in Spain at the time of the Rayazdi Taifas. Yusuf b. Tashfin, the Almoravid Amir, put an end to it. The same has also been happening in the cities of the Jurid and Ifrijiyat, ever since their chiefs gained control over them. 654. God is kind to his servants. 655. 38. Commercial activity on the part of the ruler is harmful to his subjects and ruinous to the tax revenue. 656. It should be known that a dynasty may find itself in financial straits, as we have mentioned before, on account of its luxury and the number of its luxurious habits, and on account of its expenditures and the insufficiency of the tax revenue to pay for its needs and expenditures. It may need more money and higher revenues. Then, it sometimes imposes customs duties on the commercial activities of its subjects, as we have mentioned in the previous section. Sometimes, it increases the kinds of customs duties, if customs duties as such had been introduced before. Sometimes, it applies torture to its officials and tax collectors and sucks their bones dry, of a part of their fortune. This happens when officials and tax collectors are observed to have appropriated a good deal of tax money, which their accounts do not show. 657. Sometimes, the ruler himself may engage in commerce and agriculture, from desire to increase his revenues. He sees that merchants and farmers make great profits and have plenty of property. He sees that their gains correspond to the capital they invest. Therefore, he starts to acquire livestock and fields in order to cultivate them for profit, purchase goods, and enter business and expose himself to fluctuations of the market. He thinks that this will improve his revenues and increase his profits. However, this is a great error. It causes harm to the subjects in many ways. First, farmers and merchants will find it difficult to buy livestock and merchandise and to procure cheaply the things that belong to farming and commerce. The subjects have all the same or approximately the same amount of wealth. Competition between them already exhausts, or comes close to exhausting, their financial resources. Now, when the ruler, who has so much more money than they, competes with them, scarcely a single one of them will, any longer, be able to obtain the things he wants, and everybody will become worried and unhappy. Furthermore, the ruler can appropriate much of the agricultural products and the available merchandise, if it occurs to him. He can do it by force, or by buying things up at the cheapest possible price. Further, there may be no one who would dare to bid against him. Thus, he will be able to force the seller to lower his price. Further, when agricultural products such as corn, silk, honey, sugar, and other kinds of agricultural products, or goods of any kind, become available, the ruler cannot wait for a favorable market and a boom, because he has to take care of government needs. Therefore, he forces the merchants or farmers who deal in these particular products to buy from him. He will be satisfied only with the highest prices and more. The merchants and farmers, on the other hand, will exhaust their liquid capital in such transactions. The merchandise they thus acquire will remain useless on their hands. They themselves will no longer be able to trade, which is what enables them to earn something and make their living. Often, they need money. Then, they have to sell the goods that they were forced to buy from the ruler, at the lowest prices, during a slump in the market. Often, the merchant or farmer has to do the same thing over again. He thus exhausts his capital and has to go out of business. 658. This becomes an often repeated process. The trouble and financial difficulties and the loss of profit which it causes the subjects, takes away from them all incentives to effort, thus ruining the fiscal structure. Most of the revenue from taxes comes from farmers and merchants, especially once customs duties have been introduced and the tax revenue has been augmented by means of them. Thus, when the farmer gives up agriculture and the merchant goes out of business, the revenue from taxes vanishes altogether or becomes dangerously low. Were the ruler to compare the revenue from taxes with the small profits he reaps from trading himself, he would find the latter negligible in comparison with the former. Even if his trading were profitable, it would still deprive him of a good deal of his revenue from taxes, so far as commerce is concerned. It is unlikely that customs duties might be levied on the ruler's commercial activities. If, however, the same deals were made by others, and not by the ruler, the customs duties, levied in connection with them, would be included in the tax total. Furthermore, the trading of the ruler may cause the destruction of civilization and, through the destruction and decrease of civilization, the disintegration of the dynasty. When the subjects can no longer make their capital larger through agriculture and commerce, it will decrease and disappear as the result of expenditures. This will ruin their situation. This should be understood. The Persians made no one king except members of the royal house. Further, they chose him from among those members of the royal house who possessed virtue, religion, education, liberality, bravery, and nobility. Then, they stipulated in addition that he should be just. Also, he was not to take a farm, as this would harm his neighbors. He was not to engage in trade, as this would of necessity raise the prices of all goods. And he was not to use slaves as servants, since they would not give good and beneficial advice. It should be known that the finances of a ruler can be increased, and his financial resources improved, only through the revenue from taxes. The revenue from taxes can be improved only through the equitable treatment of people with property and regard for them. This makes their hopes rise, and they have the incentive to start making their capital bear fruit and grow. This, in turn, increases the ruler's revenues in taxes. Other measures taken by the ruler, such as engaging in commerce or agriculture, soon turn out to be harmful to the subjects, to be ruinous to the revenues, and to decrease cultural activity. Emirs and other men in power in a country who engage in commerce and agriculture, reach a point where they undertake to buy agricultural products and goods from their owners who come to them, at prices fixed by themselves as they see fit. Then, they resell these things to the subjects under their control, at the proper times, at prices fixed by themselves. This is even more dangerous, harmful, and ruinous for the subjects than the aforementioned procedure. The ruler is often influenced to choose such a course by that sort of people, I mean, merchants and farmers, who bring him into contact with the profession in which they have been reared. They influence the ruler to choose this course. They work with him, but for their own profit, to garner quickly as much money as they may wish, especially through profits reaped from doing business without having to pay taxes and customs duties. Exemption from taxes and customs duties is more likely than anything else to cause one's capital to grow, and it brings quick profits. These people do not understand how much damage is caused the ruler by each decrease in the revenue from taxes. The ruler, therefore, must guard against such persons, and not pay any attention to suggestions that are harmful to his revenues and his rule. May God inspire us to choose the right course for ourselves, and may He make us profit from our beneficial actions. There is no Lord except Him. 39. The ruler and his entourage are wealthy only. In the middle period of the dynasty. The reason for this is that at the beginning of the dynasty, the revenues are distributed among the tribe 659 and the people who share in the ruler's group feeling, in accordance with their usefulness and group feeling and because they are needed to establish the dynasty, as we have stated before. 660 Under these circumstances, their leader refrains in their favor from claiming the revenues which they would like to have. He feels compensated for his restraint by the control over them that he hopes to establish. They can put pressure on him, and he needs them. His share of the revenues is restricted to the very small amounts he needs. Consequently, the members of his entourage and company, his wazirs, secretaries, and clients, usually can be observed to be destitute. Their position is restricted, because it depends on the position of their master, and the authority of his position is narrowed down by the competition of the people who share in his group feeling. Then, when royal authority has come into its own and the ruler has obtained control over his people, he prevents them from getting any part of the revenues beyond their official shares. Their portions shrink, because their usefulness to the dynasty has diminished. Their influence has been checked, and clients and followers have come to share with them in the support of the dynasty and the establishment of its power. At this time, the ruler disposes alone of the whole income from taxes, or the greater part of it. He keeps this money, and holds it for spending on important projects. His wealth grows. His treasuries are filled. The authority of his position expands, and he dominates all his people. As a consequence, the men of his entourage and retinue, the wazir, the secretary, the doorkeeper, hajib, the client, and the policeman, all become more important, and their positions expand. They acquire property and enrich themselves. Then, when the dynasty starts to become senile, as the result of the dissolution of group feeling and the disappearance of the tribe that founded it, the ruler needs supporters and helpers, because there are then many seceders, rivals, and rebels, and there is the fear of complete destruction. His revenues then go to his allies and supporters, military men who have their own group feelings. He spends his treasures and revenues on attempts to restore the power of the dynasty. 661. Moreover, the revenue from taxes decreases, as we have stated before. 662. Because there are many allowances to be paid and expenditures to be made. The revenues from the land tax decrease. The dynasty's need for money becomes more urgent. The intimates, the doorkeepers, hajib, and the secretaries no longer live under the shadow of prosperity and luxury, as their positions lose importance and the authority of the ruler's position shrinks. The ruler's need for money at this time becomes even more urgent. The new generation within his inner circle and entourage spend the money with which their fathers had enriched themselves, for a purpose for which it was not intended, namely, that of helping the ruler. They begin to be no longer as sincerely loyal as their fathers and ancestors had been. The ruler, in turn, becomes of the opinion that he is more entitled than they to the wealth that was acquired by their fathers during the reign of his predecessors and with the help of their position. He takes it and appropriates it for himself, gradually, and according to their ranks. As a result, the dynasty becomes detestable. 663 to them, and, in turn, it is the dynasty that suffers therefrom. It loses its entourage and great personalities and its rich and wealthy intimates. A great part of the edifice of glory crumbles, after having been supported and built up to a great height by those who shared in it. One may compare what happened in this regard to the Abbasid wazirs, such as the Banu Qutbah, the Barmecides, the Banu Saul, the Banu Tahir, and others. One may further compare what happened at the time of the dissolution of the Umayyad dynasty in Spain in the days of the Reyes de Tafas, to the Banu Shuhud, the Banu Abi Abda, the Banu Hudayr, the Banu Bird, and others. The same is happening in the dynasty we have lived to see in our own time. This is how God proceeds. And verily, you will not be able to change God's way. 664. Anticipating such dangerous situations, most of the people in the dynasty try to avoid holding any government position. They try to escape from government control and go to some other region with the government property they have acquired. They are of the opinion that, to do this will be more wholesome for them and give them the opportunity to spend and enjoy their money in greater safety. This assumption is a great mistake and a self-deception that will ruin them materially. It should be known that it is difficult and impossible to escape from official life, after having once been in it. When the person who has such intentions is the ruler himself, his subjects and the people who share in his group feeling and crowd around him will not for a moment permit him to escape. If any such intention on his part becomes visible, it means the destruction of his realm and the ruin of himself. This would be the usual result in such a case, for it is difficult to escape from the servitude of royal authority, especially when the dynasty has reached its peak and its authority is shrinking, and it is becoming more remote from glory and good qualities, and acquiring bad qualities. If the person who intends to escape is one of the ruler's inner circle and entourage or one of the dignitaries in his dynasty, he rarely is given the opportunity to do so. The reason is, in the first place, that rulers consider their people and entourage and, indeed, all their subjects as slaves familiar with their thoughts and sentiments. Therefore, they are not disposed to loosen the bonds of servitude binding the person, who may have the desire to escape. They want to avoid the chance that someone, outside, might come to know their secrets and their circumstances through that person, and they are averse to letting him become the servant of others. The Spanish Umayyads thus prevented their people from going abroad to fulfill the duty of the pilgrimage. They were afraid they might fall into the hands of the Abbasids. During all their days, none of their people made the pilgrimage. The pilgrimage was, again, permitted to Spaniards, who belonged to the various dynasties in Spain, only after the Umayyad rule had come to an end and Spain had reverted to control of the Reyes de Taifas. In the second place, even if rulers were kind enough to loosen the bonds of a person who intended to escape from their control, their kindness would not extend to leaving his property alone. They consider it part of their own wealth in the same way that its owner has been part of their dynasty inasmuch as it was obtained only through the dynasty and under the shadow of its authority. Therefore, they are most eager to take his property and to let it remain as it is, as something belonging to the dynasty that they are entitled to use. Furthermore, assuming that he gets away with his property to some other region, which happens in very rare cases, he is not safe there either, because the eyes of the rulers in that region fall on him, and they deprive him of his property, by indirect threats and intimidation or by open force. They consider his property as revenue or as government property, which should be spent in the public interest. If the eyes of rulers can fall upon rich and wealthy people who have acquired their money in the exercise of a profession, as we have mentioned, 665, it is all the more understandable that their eyes can fall upon tax monies and government property, to which they have access by law and custom. One may compare what happened to the judge of Jabala 666. He had revolted against Ibn Amr, the master of Tripoli. The European Christians took Jabala away from him. He fled to Damascus and then to Baghdad, which was under the rule of Sultan Barki-Arak B. Malik Shah. That was at the end of the 5th–11th century. The wazir of the Sultan went to the judge of Jabala and borrowed most of his money from him. Then, they cleaned him out completely. It was an inestimable amount. Sultan Abu Yahya Zakaria B. Ahmad al-Layani, the 9th or the 10th of the Hafsid rulers in Ifriqiya, 667, intended to get away from the responsibility of royal authority and to go to Egypt. He wanted to escape the ruler of the western border regions when, the latter, prepared for a raid on Tunis. Ibn al-Layani, therefore, pretended to make a trip to the border region of Tripoli, in order to conceal the preparations for his escape. There, he boarded ship and escaped to Alexandria. He had taken with him all the property and treasures he found in the treasury, and he had sold all the furniture, real property, and jewelry in the Hafsid treasuries, even including the books. He took all that along with him to Egypt. He took up residence with al-Malik an-Nasir Muhammad b. Khala'an in the year 719. 1319–668, al-Malik an-Nasir treated him hospitably and gave him a place of honor. But he did not cease to deprive him of his treasure, gradually, by indirect demands, until he had gotten it all. The only livelihood remaining to Ibn al-Layani was the salary that al-Malik an-Nasir granted him until his death in 728, 1327/28, as we shall mention in his History 669. This and similar things belong among the delusions to which the people of dynasties fall prey, when they suspect that the ruler is a danger to them. They may indeed escape with their lives, if they succeed in escaping. But to imagine that it is a necessity is an erroneous and baseless assumption. The renown they obtain in government service suffices for them to find livelihoods for themselves, either in the form of a salary paid by a ruler or in the form of a position in the profitable exercise of commerce and agriculture. Dynasties are, related, 670, but the soul is ambitious, if it is given the opportunity. 671, but if it is reduced to little, it is satisfied. God gives sustenance. He is strong and solid. 672. 40. Curtailment of the allowances given by the ruler. Implies curtailment of the tax revenue. The 673 reason for this is that dynasty and government serve as the world's greatest marketplace. 674. Providing the substance of civilization. Now, if the ruler holds on to property and revenue, or they are lost or not properly used by him, then the property in the possession of the ruler's entourage 675 will be small. The gifts which they, in their turn, had been used to give to their entourage and people, stop, and all their expenditures are cut down. They constitute the greatest number of people, who make expenditures, and their expenditures provide more of the substance of trade than the expenditures of any other group of people. Thus, when they stop spending, business slumps and commercial profits decline because of the shortage of capital. Revenues from the land tax decrease, because the land tax and taxation, in general, depend on cultural activity, commercial transactions, business prosperity, and the people's demand for gain and profit. It is the dynasty that suffers from the situation and that has a deficit, because under these circumstances the property of the ruler decreases in consequence of the decrease in revenues from the land tax. As we have stated, the dynasty is the greatest market, the mother and base of all trade. It is the market that provides the substance of income and expenditures for trade. If government business slumps and the volume of trade is small, the dependent markets will naturally show the same symptoms, and to a greater degree. Furthermore, money circulates between subjects and ruler, moving back and forth. Now, if the ruler keeps it to himself, it is lost to the subjects. This is how God proceeds with his servants. 41. Injustice brings about the ruin of civilization. It 676 should be known that attacks on people's property remove the incentive to acquire and gain property. People, then, become of the opinion that the purpose and ultimate destiny of acquiring property is to have it taken away from them. When the incentive to acquire and obtain property is gone, people no longer make efforts to acquire any. The extent and degree to which property rights are infringed upon determines the extent and degree to which the efforts of the subjects to acquire property slacken. When attacks on property are extensive and general, extending to all means of making a livelihood, business inactivity, too, becomes general, because the general extent of such attacks upon property means a general destruction of the incentive to do business. If the attacks upon property are but light, the stoppage of gainful activity is correspondingly slight. Civilization and its well-being as well as business prosperity depend on productivity and people's efforts in all directions in their own interest and profit. When people no longer do business in order to make a living, and when they cease all gainful activity, the business of civilization slumps, and everything decays. People scatter everywhere in search of sustenance, to places outside the jurisdiction of their present government. The population of the particular region becomes light. The settlements there become empty. The cities lie in ruins. The disintegration of civilization causes the disintegration of the status of dynasty and ruler, because their peculiar status constitutes the form of civilization and the form necessarily decays when its matter. In this case, civilization decays 676a. One may compare, here, the story which Al-Masudi tells in connection with the history of the Persians 677 in the days of King Bahram b. Bahram, the Mobid Han, the chief religious dignitary among the Persians, expressed to the king his disapproval of the latter's injustice and neglect for the consequences that his injustice must bring upon the dynasty. He did this through a parable, which he placed in the mouth of an owl. The king, hearing the cry of an owl, asked the Mobid Han whether he understood what it was saying. The Mobid Han replied, a male owl wanted to marry a female owl. The female owl, as a condition prior to consent, asked the male owl for the gift of 20 villages ruined in the days of Bahram, that she might hoot in them. The male owl accepted her condition and said to her, if the king continues to rule, I shall give you 1,000 ruined villages. This is of all wishes the easiest to fulfill. The king was stirred out of his negligence by that story. He had a private talk with the Muqaddimah and asked him what he had in mind. The Muqaddimah replied, O king, the might of royal authority materializes only through the religious law, obedience toward God, and compliance with his commands and prohibitions. The religious law persists only through royal authority. Mighty royal authority is achieved only through men. Men persist only with the help of property. The only way to property is through cultivation. The only way to cultivation is through justice. Justice is a balance set up among mankind. The Lord set it up and appointed an overseer of it, and that is the ruler. You, O king, went after the farms and took them away from their owners and cultivators. They are the people who pay the land tax and from whom one gets money. You gave their farms as fiefs to your entourage and servants and to sluggards. They did not cultivate the farms, and did not heed the consequences. They did not look for the things that would be good for the farms. They were leniently treated with regard to the land tax, and were not asked to pay it, because they were close to the king. The remaining landowners who did pay the land tax and cultivated their farms had to carry an unjust burden. Therefore, they left their farms and abandoned their settlements. They took refuge in farms that were far away or difficult of access, and lived on them. Thus, cultivation slackened, and the farms were ruined. There was little money, and soldiers and subjects perished. Neighboring rulers coveted the Persian realm, because they were aware of the fact that the basic materials that alone maintain the foundation of a realm had been cut off. When the king heard that, he proceeded to look into the affairs of his realm. The farms were taken away from the intimates of the ruler and restored to their owners. They were again treated as they had formerly been treated. They began again to cultivate their farms. Those who had been weak gained in strength. The land was cultivated, and the country became prosperous. There was much money for the collectors of the land tax. The army was strengthened. The enemy's sources of strength were cut off. The frontier garrisons were manned. The ruler proceeded to take personal charge of his affairs. His days were prosperous, and his realm was well organized. The lesson this story teaches is that injustice ruins civilization. The ruin of civilization has as its consequence the complete destruction of the dynasty. In this connection, one should disregard the fact that dynasties, centered in great cities, often infringe upon justice and still are not ruined. It should be known that this is the result of a relationship that exists between such infringements and the situation of the urban population. When a city is large and densely populated and unlimited in the variety of its conditions, the loss it suffers from hostile acts and injustice is small, because such losses take place gradually. Because of the great variety of conditions and the manifold productivity of a particular city, any loss may remain concealed. Its consequences will become visible only after some time. Thus, the dynasty which committed the infringements of justice may be replaced before the city is ruined. Another dynasty may make its appearance and restore the city with the help of its wealth. Thus, the previous loss which had remained concealed is made up and is scarcely noticed. This, however, happens only rarely. The proven fact is that civilization inevitably suffers losses through injustice and hostile acts, as we have mentioned, and it is the dynasty that suffers therefrom. Injustice should not be understood to imply only the confiscation of money or other property from the owners, without compensation and without cause. It is commonly understood in that way, but it is something more general than that. Whoever takes someone's property, or uses him for forced labor, or presses an unjustified claim against him, or imposes upon him a duty not required by the religious law, does an injustice to that particular person. People who collect unjustified taxes commit an injustice. Those who infringe upon property rights commit an injustice. Those who take away property commit an injustice. Those who deny people their rights commit an injustice. Those who, in general, take property by force, commit an injustice. It is the dynasty that suffers from all these acts, inasmuch as civilization, which is the substance of the dynasty, 677a is ruined when people have lost all incentive. It should be known that this is what the lawgiver, Muhammad, actually had in mind when he forbade injustice. He meant the resulting destruction and ruin of civilization, which ultimately permits the eradication of the human species. This is what the religious law quite generally and wisely aims at in emphasizing 5 things as necessary: the preservation of 1. The religion, 2. The soul, life, 3. The intellect, 4. Progeny, and 5. Property. Since, as we have seen, injustice calls for the eradication of the human species by leading to the ruin of civilization, it contains in itself a good reason for being prohibited. Consequently, it is important that it be forbidden. There is ample evidence for that in the Quran and the Sunnah. It is much too ample to have it accurately or fully presented here. If injustice were to be committed by every individual, the list of deterring punishments that would then have been given for it, in the religious law, would be as large as that given for the other crimes, which lead to the destruction of the human species and which everybody is capable of committing, such as adultery, murder, and drunkenness. However, injustice can be committed only by persons who cannot be touched, only by persons who have power and authority. Therefore, injustice has been very much censured, and repeated threats against it have been expressed in the hope that perhaps the persons who are able to commit injustice will find a restraining influence in themselves. Your Lord does not do injustice to his servants. 678. It should not be objected that punishment for highway robbery is provided for in the religious law, 679, and that highway robbery is an injustice that can be committed only by someone who has the ability to commit it, inasmuch as the highway robber, when he commits the robbery, must have the ability to do it. The reply to that would be twofold. First, it may be said that the punishment laid down for highway robbery is for crimes against life or property that the highway robber commits. This is an opinion held by many. The punishment applies only after one has gained power over him and brought him to account for his crime. 680 Highway robbery itself has no fixed legal punishment. Second, it may be said that the highway robber cannot be described as having the ability to commit injustice, because we understand by ability to commit injustice that the person has a free hand and there is no rival power, which means that he has a power to bring about complete ruin. The ability of the highway robber is merely an ability to cause fear. This fear then enables the highway robber to take away the property of others. Everyone may defend himself against it, according to both the religious and the political law. It is not, then, an ability that could bring about complete ruin. God has power to do what he wishes. One of the greatest injustices and one which contributes most to the destruction of civilization is the unjustified imposition of tasks and the use of the subjects for forced labor. This is so because labor belongs to the things that constitute capital, as we shall explain in the chapter on sustenance. 681 Gain and sustenance represent the value realized from labor among civilized people. All their efforts and all their labors are means for them to acquire capital and to make a profit. They have no other way to make a profit except through labor. Subjects employed in cultural enterprises gain their livelihood and profit from such activities. Now, if they are obliged to work outside their own field and are used for forced labor unrelated to their ordinary ways of making a living, they no longer have any profit and are thus deprived of the price of their labor, which is their capital, asset. They suffer, and a good deal of their livelihood is gone, or even all of it. If this occurs repeatedly, all incentive to cultural enterprise is destroyed, and they cease utterly to make an effort. This leads to the destruction and ruin of civilization. God gives sustenance to whomever He wishes to give it, without accounting. 682. An injustice even greater and more destructive of civilization and the dynasty than the one just mentioned is the appropriation of people's property by buying their possessions as cheaply as possible and then reselling the merchandise to them at the highest possible prices by means of forced sales and purchases. Often, people have to accept high prices with the privilege of later payment. They console themselves for the loss they suffer at the moment, with the hope that the market will fluctuate in favor of the merchandise that had been sold to them at such a high price, and that their loss will be cancelled later on. But then, they are required to make payment at once, and they are forced to sell the merchandise at the lowest possible price. The loss involved in the two transactions affects their capital. 683. This situation affects all kinds of merchants, those resident in town and those who import merchandise from elsewhere. It also affects the peddlers and shopkeepers who deal in food and fruit, as well as the craftsmen who deal in the instruments and implements that are in general use. The loss affects all professions and classes quite generally. This goes on from hour to hour. 684. It causes all capital funds to dwindle. The only possibility that remains is for the merchants to go out of business, because their capital is gone, as it can no longer be restored by the profits. Merchants who come from elsewhere for the purchase and sale of merchandise are slow to come, because of that situation. Business declines, and the subjects lose their livelihood, which, generally, comes from trading. Therefore, if no trading is being done in the markets, they have no livelihood, and the tax revenue of the ruler decreases or deteriorates, since, in the middle period of a dynasty and later on, most of the tax revenue comes from customs duties on commerce. As we have stated before. 685. This leads to the dissolution of the dynasty and the decay of urban civilization. The disintegration comes about gradually and imperceptibly. This happens whenever the ways and means of seizing property described above are used. On the other hand, if the property is taken outright and if the hostile acts are extended to affect the property, the wives, the lives, the skins, 685a and the honor of people, it will lead to sudden disintegration and decay and the quick destruction of the dynasty. It will result in disturbances leading to complete destruction. On account of these evil consequences, all such unfair activities are prohibited by the religious law. The religious law legalizes the use of cunning in trading, but forbids depriving people of their property illegally. The purpose is to prevent such evil consequences, which would lead to the destruction of civilization through disturbances or the lack of opportunity to make a living. It should be known that all these practices are caused by the need for more money on the part of dynasty and ruler, because they have become accustomed to luxurious living. Their expenditures increase, and much spending is done. The ordinary income does not meet the expenditures. Therefore, the ruler invents new sorts and kinds of taxes, in order to increase the revenues and to be able to balance the budget. But luxury continues to grow, and spending increases on account of it. The need for appropriating people's property becomes stronger and stronger. In this way, the authority of the dynasty shrinks until its influence is wiped out and its identity lost and it is defeated by an attacker. God determines all affairs. There is no lord except Him.